The night pressed down like a suffocating blanket, the wind whispering threats through the trees. Sarah sat alone, the eerie silence of the old house wrapping around her, broken only by the creaks of floorboards beneath her feet. Her phone remained silent. No messages, no parents. A deep sense of dread gnawed at her, the house itself seeming to breathe, to watch. Shadows shifted and sounds echoed from the dark corners. She had heard the stories, but they were supposed to be just that, stories. Now, on her first night as a babysitter, Sarah wasn't so sure. Something was wrong. Something was waiting. And it was closer than she realized. The night was heavier than usual, thick with a sense of something lurking just beyond the grasp of reason. The wind howled outside, making the branches of the trees claw at the windows as if trying to break free. The only light came from a flickering porch bulb, casting an eerie glow on the empty street. It wasn't supposed to be this way. She hadn't expected to be sitting alone in this dark house, not on her first night as a babysitter. Sarah glanced at her phone. No messages from the parents. No sign of them coming back anytime soon. The silence in the house was almost unbearable, except for the occasional creak of the old floorboards under her feet. The house was large, old, and unfamiliar to her. Those were the thoughts she kept trying to ignore. She should have been excited to be earning her own money for the first time. But as she sat there in the dimly lit living room, her heart began to race. She'd heard the stories. Babysitters who had found themselves in terrifying situations, stories that never seemed real. But now, sitting here, she wondered if maybe those stories weren't as far-fetched as they seemed. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second dragging its feet like it had nowhere to be. Every creak in the house made her jump, her pulse quickening as she felt her nerves getting the best of her. She'd been sitting there for what felt like hours, trying to keep her composure. The child she was watching, Megan, a sweet but quiet 7-year-old, had long since gone to bed. Sarah had checked on her once, just to be sure, but everything was fine. Megan was asleep, tucked in tight. Still, the house felt off. It wasn't just the emptiness of it, or the fact that Sarah was alone. It was something about the house itself. The way the air felt thick, heavy. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't the only one there. A sound broke through the silence. Soft, barely noticeable, like a whisper carried on the wind. It came from upstairs. Sarah froze. She stood up and moved toward the staircase, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence had returned, but now, the air felt colder. She hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, her mind racing. Was it just her imagination? Had she imagined the sound? But then it came again. A soft thud. Like someone had dropped something upstairs. Her instincts screamed at her to leave. But she didn't. She took the first step up the stairs, then another. Each step creaked under her weight, making her wonder if it was louder than it should be. By the time she reached the top, the house seemed unnaturally still. Not a sound, not a movement. Only the dim, flickering light from the hallway. She peered down the hall, where the door to Megan's room stood ajar. Everything seemed fine. Her little heart was still thumping loudly in her chest, but she told herself she was just being paranoid. She had to be. But as she approached the room, something felt off. Megan wasn't in her bed. The sheets were tangled, as if she'd tossed and turned in the middle of the night, but there was no sign of her. Sarah's eyes quickly scanned the room. The closet door was slightly cracked open, but there was no sound. Nothing moved. Nothing out of place. Then she heard it again. A sound from down the hall, a soft shuffle of footsteps on the wooden floor. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She turned and walked slowly toward the sound, trying to keep her steps quiet. She was about to reach the hallway when, from the corner of her eye, she saw a flash of movement. It was only for a second, but it was enough. A figure, a shadow, darted across the hallway, disappearing around the corner toward the stairs. She blinked, trying to process what she saw. Was it a trick of the light? Or was someone else in the house? Her mind raced, thinking back to the parents' instructions. They hadn't said anything about guests or family members coming over. No one was supposed to be here except her and Megan. Before she could think too much about it, she heard a soft, almost inaudible giggle. Her head snapped toward the sound. It was coming from downstairs. Megan? But no, that wasn't possible. Sarah's heart began to pound harder. She was certain that giggle hadn't come from the child she'd left asleep in her room. Panic began to settle in her chest. She had to check it out. She couldn't just ignore it, not now. Her feet moved faster than her mind, and she found herself heading down the stairs, her body rigid, every muscle screaming at her to stop. But she couldn't. When she reached the bottom, the house was darker than before. The flickering light from the porch barely made its way inside through the windows. The faint sound of a child's laughter echoed in her ears, this time followed by the soft thud of small feet running. Sarah glanced nervously toward the front door, half expecting someone to be standing there. But no one was. The door was still locked, just as she had left it. But something was wrong. Her heart began to race even faster as she heard the soft sound of whispers. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The walls, the floorboards, the air, it all seemed alive with sound. The whispers became clearer, more distinct. And then, one word cut through the noise, sent her stomach plummeting into her feet. Sarah. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't Megan's voice. It wasn't the voice of anyone she recognized. The whispers faded, leaving only a ringing silence. Sarah's chest tightened, the weight of the night pressing down on her. She knew she had to leave, but her feet felt glued to the floor. She didn't know what she had heard, but it was enough. Enough to make her heart race uncontrollably, enough to make the shadows of the house feel alive, watching her every move. Sarah slowly turned toward the stairs, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. She took one last look down the dark hallway, where the whispering seemed to echo. Her mind screamed for her to leave, to run out into the night and never look back. But there was something in the air, something that kept her from turning the doorknob. She could feel it. Feel the house holding her captive. As she moved slowly toward the staircase, her eyes caught the faintest movement at the end of the hallway. A figure, just a glimpse. But it wasn't Megan. This time, it was someone, or something, much taller. It stood in the shadows, unmoving. Waiting. Sarah took one step back, then another. But her eyes never left the figure in the dark. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The house was silent again. But Sarah didn't feel safe. Not anymore. The figure wasn't done with her. And she wasn't sure how much longer she could pretend she was. The air felt heavier than before, thick with something that could only be described as dread. Sarah stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, her mind racing with questions that had no answers. She had just seen a shadow, a figure standing in the hallway, barely visible but enough to send a jolt of cold fear through her. Her eyes had locked onto it for a moment, but the second she blinked, it had vanished into the darkness. The silence that followed was suffocating, almost too quiet. She couldn't be imagining this. Could she? The logical part of her brain screamed that this was all just nerves. She was alone in a strange house, far from home, and the combination of darkness and isolation could make anyone paranoid. But then there was the laughter, the voice that had whispered her name. That wasn't her imagination. That wasn't her nerves. There was something else here with her. Something that wasn't supposed to be. Megan. She needed to find Megan. Her mind snapped back to reality. Megan was still upstairs. The little girl had been in her bed just a few moments ago. Sarah's eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement, any sound that could reassure her. But nothing moved. The house was still. Too still. The kind of stillness that made her feel like she was walking through a graveyard, each step echoing louder in the emptiness. She knew she had to go upstairs to check on Megan. She couldn't just stay down here, waiting for something else to happen. But each step toward the stairs felt like a betrayal of her instincts. Something was wrong. Her body screamed at her to turn around, to leave the house, but she forced herself to take another step. She couldn't just leave. Not when the parents were trusting her. Not when Megan was still up there, alone. Taking a deep breath, Sarah began to climb the stairs slowly. Each creak of the wood beneath her feet seemed deafening in the oppressive silence. As she ascended, the light from the hallway above flickered, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor, dancing in the corners of her vision. She tried to focus on the staircase in front of her, on the task at hand, but her mind kept slipping back to the shadow she'd seen. What was it? Was it a person? Or something else? Something that shouldn't be in this house? When she reached the top, she stood there for a moment, her breath shallow. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the fear creeping back into every fiber of her being. The hallway stretched out in front of her, dark and quiet. Megan's room was at the end, its door slightly ajar. Sarah moved cautiously toward the room, each step measured, as if she were walking through a minefield. Her hand reached out to push the door open, but before she could touch the doorknob, a sound stopped her. A whisper, soft and unintelligible, came from inside the room. Her body went rigid. She knew she had heard it. She couldn't tell if it had been Megan, or if it had been something else entirely. The voice was muffled, as though it came from beneath the blankets, or from behind the walls. It wasn't Megan's usual voice. It was something else. Her pulse quickened, and she hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open slowly. The room was dimly lit by the faint glow of the streetlights outside. Megan's bed was empty, the blankets tangled as if the little girl had been restless in her sleep. The night light in the corner flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. The silence in the room was thick, suffocating. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A small toy, one of Megan's stuffed animals, was sitting upright on the edge of the bed. But the way it sat there, it wasn't natural. It was as if it had been placed there deliberately, as if someone had set it up to watch Sarah. "Stop it," Sarah whispered to herself, her voice trembling. She walked into the room, her eyes scanning every corner, every inch of the floor. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Something was wrong. She just couldn't put her finger on it. "Megan," she called out softly, her voice shaking with uncertainty. There was no answer. She checked the closet, but it was empty. She checked under the bed, but it was just shadows and dust. Megan was nowhere to be found. The door to the bathroom was ajar. Sarah's stomach churned as she approached it, her steps hesitant. The door creaked as she pushed it open. The bathroom was dark, the only light coming from the crack beneath the door. But as soon as the door swung wide, she saw it, Megan's reflection in the mirror. She froze. The little girl stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide with something that was not fear, but something darker, something alien. Megan didn't move. She just stood there, staring at Sarah through the mirror, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper, her throat tight. Megan didn't answer. She just stood there, her reflection watching Sarah, not moving. Her mouth didn't even twitch. It was as if she wasn't really there at all. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her breath came in short gasps as she stepped back, away from the door. She had to get out of there. This wasn't right. She didn't know what was happening, but it felt wrong. Everything about this house felt wrong. She turned and rushed out of the bathroom, her pulse racing. She had to find Megan. She had to get out of there. But as she passed the hallway, she saw something. There, at the far end of the hallway, stood a figure. A tall figure, draped in shadows. The figure didn't move, but Sarah could feel its presence as if it were pressing down on her. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes locked onto the figure. It wasn't Megan. It wasn't anyone she recognized. It was just a dark, tall shape, standing there, waiting. Her body froze, her mind refusing to process what was happening. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. She felt paralyzed, her feet glued to the floor. The figure remained still, like a statue, but its presence was overwhelming. Then, slowly it began to move. Its steps were slow, deliberate. Sarah's heart raced as the figure began to walk toward her. The darkness that surrounded it seemed to ripple, as if it were alive, as if the very air around it was shifting. "Megan!" Sarah called again, her voice cracking. But the figure didn't answer. It didn't speak. It just kept moving closer, its shape becoming clearer with every step. It was tall, its outline shifting like smoke in the dim light. And then, just as it seemed to be inches from her, it disappeared. Vanished into thin air, leaving only the eerie silence behind. Sarah stood there, her body trembling, her mind reeling. What was happening? What was that thing? Was it a ghost? Was it real? She didn't know, and she didn't care. All she knew was that she needed to leave. She turned to run back down the stairs, but the moment she stepped onto the first step, a voice echoed in her mind, soft, but unmistakable. You shouldn't have stayed after midnight. Her blood ran cold. The voice wasn't from the figure. It wasn't from Megan. It was something else. Something that had been waiting for her. And she realized, with a sickening feeling in her gut, that whatever it wasn't done with her yet. Sarah's heart was pounding as she stumbled down the staircase, her hand gripping the railing for support. Every muscle in her body was tense, her mind racing with panic and confusion. The house, once so large and empty, now felt like a trap. Each step she took seemed to echo in the hollow space, the creak of the stairs amplified by the silence that hung in the air. She tried to steady her breathing, but it felt impossible. Every part of her wanted to run, to leave this place, to escape whatever dark force had begun to consume it. But something kept her rooted to the ground, a force she couldn't name, a sense of duty, or was it fear? Fear of what might happen if she didn't stay. She reached the bottom of the stairs, and before she could make a decision on what to do next, she heard it again. The sound that had been haunting her, the soft, distant sound of someone crying. It was coming from upstairs. Megan. Sarah's pulse quickened. She had to find Megan. She had to be sure that the little girl was safe. But as Sarah turned back toward the stairs, the crying stopped. Her breath hitched and she stood frozen, listening. Silence. The kind of silence that presses down on you, suffocating and oppressive. The house seemed to close in on her, the walls narrowing as if they were inching closer, constricting. She turned toward the hallway, her gaze flicking to the shadows that stretched along the walls. The house felt darker now, and the shadows seemed to pulse with something unseen, something waiting. As Sarah moved down the hall, the floor beneath her feet creaked loudly in the quiet. She couldn't remember if she had ever felt more alone in her life. She reached Megan's room, the door still cracked open, and her mind flooded with questions. Why wasn't Megan there? Why had she heard that crying? She pushed the door open fully and peered inside. The room was exactly as it had been before. The bed was still unmade, the blankets tangled as if the child had been tossing and turning. But the room felt cold. The kind of cold that seeped into your bones, the kind of cold that you couldn't escape. And then she saw it. The stuffed animal that had been sitting upright on the edge of the bed. It wasn't in its original place anymore. It had been moved. The way it was positioned, propped up at an unnatural angle, made Sarah's stomach twist. She couldn't explain it, but the way the toy was sitting made her feel like it was watching her, waiting for her to make a move. A chill ran through Sarah's spine as she stepped farther into the room. Her mind was racing. What was happening here? The house felt more wrong than ever before, like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. The air was thick with an eerie stillness, like something was holding its breath, waiting for her to make a mistake. Megan, she called again, her voice trembling as she glanced around the room. No answer. She walked toward the closet, the darkness inside seeming to draw her in. She reached for the door, her hand trembling as it grasped the handle. She pulled it open. Empty. The clothes hung lifeless, swaying gently in the cool air. Nothing seemed out of place, but the longer she stood there, the more wrong everything felt. She turned to leave the room but stopped when she heard it again. The faintest sound of movement, a rustle. She spun around, her eyes darting around the room, but there was nothing there. No Megan. No movement. A shiver ran through her as she slowly backed out of the room, her pulse racing. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe Megan had gotten up, maybe she was playing somewhere else in the house. But deep down, Sarah knew the truth. Something was wrong. Something had happened to Megan, and it wasn't just a child's game. She crept down the hall, her eyes scanning the darkness as she made her way to the other rooms. Every corner felt like it held some new, unspeakable horror waiting to be revealed. She checked the bathroom, but it was empty. No sign of Megan. She checked the other rooms, but all were dark and silent. Then she reached the living room. It was quiet, too quiet. The flickering light from the street outside cast long shadows across the walls. She paused in the doorway, her eyes scanning the room. It looked exactly as it had when she first entered the house, nothing out of place. But as Sarah stepped inside, something caught her eye. The front door was slightly ajar. Her breath caught in her throat. The door had been locked when she had arrived. She knew she had checked it before. Had someone come in? What? What were they doing here? Why wasn't Megan in the house? Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she approached the door, her hands shaking as she gently pushed it open further. The night air was cold, seeping into the house, carrying with it the smell of damp leaves and something else, something darker. She stepped outside, her shoes crunching on the gravel. The yard was dark, shadows moving across the ground as if they had a life of their own. The wind whispered through the trees, the branches swaying like ghostly arms reaching out to grab her. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, to go inside, but she couldn't. Something was pulling her forward. Something was driving her to see this through. She stepped closer to the edge of the yard, her eyes scanning the darkness. Nothing moved. The house behind her seemed distant, its windows like hollow eyes staring out at the night. And then she heard it. A faint sound, faint but unmistakable. It came from behind her, from the direction of the house. A soft, muffled giggle. Her blood ran cold. She whipped around, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound came again, louder this time, and Sarah's stomach dropped. It was coming from inside the house. She could hear it as clear as day now. Someone or something was laughing. Not Megan. The laugh was wrong. It wasn't childlike or innocent. It was dark, twisted, and it sent a wave of nausea through her. Without thinking, Sarah ran back toward the house, her feet pounding against the gravel. She reached the front door and pushed it open, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Inside, the house was as still as it had been before. But now it felt different. The air was thick, charged with an almost electric energy, as though something was stirring just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to break free. The laughter stopped. And in the silence that followed, Sarah heard something else. A whisper. Her name. It came from the direction of the stairs. Her pulse spiked as she turned toward the staircase. The whispers were growing louder now, coming from everywhere, surrounding her, seeping into her mind. They weren't coming from anyone in the house. They were coming from something in the house. The voice was familiar. It wasn't Megan. It wasn't anyone she knew. It was the same voice that had called her before, the voice that had whispered her name when she was upstairs. It was the same voice that had come from the shadows. Megan! Sarah called again, her voice barely above a whisper, her throat tight with fear. But there was no answer. Only the laughter. The soft, cruel giggles that echoed in her mind, bouncing off the walls and growing louder. And then the shadows shifted. Something was coming for her. The house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the very walls pressing in on Sarah, suffocating her with a sense of dread that had no origin, no explanation. The laughter, soft and mocking, still echoed in her ears, reverberating through the house like the taunting of a cruel ghost. It was the kind of laugh that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand at attention, the kind that chilled the air around her. The silence that followed was deafening. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet felt like it might be the beginning of something far worse. Sarah's heart was a frantic rhythm, pounding in her chest, drowning out everything else. Her mind raced. She had to get out. The instinct was primal, the need to escape overpowering, but her legs refused to move. She was rooted to the spot, her body betraying her as she stood frozen in the dim light of the hallway, her eyes flicking nervously toward the staircase. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her, something just out of sight. The staircase, with its worn wooden steps, seemed to stretch upward like a dark, endless void, inviting her into the shadows above. Each step she took toward the stairs was heavier than the last, the air thick with tension. The house was eerily still again, the kind of stillness that made her question if she was really alone. The weight of the silence was suffocating, pressing against her chest with every breath she took. Sarah stopped just at the foot of the stairs, her hand hovering over the rail, torn between the overwhelming urge to run and the terrifying need to search for Megan. She had to find the little girl. But the whispers were back, soft at first, like a breeze, then growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from the very walls, curling around her ears, filling her head. Her name. A soft, drawn-out version of it, like a plea. The voice wasn't Megan's. It wasn't even human, not in the way she understood it. It was distorted, like something, or someone, trying to speak through a veil of smoke. It came again, the whisper growing louder, clearer. Sarah. The chill in the air deepened, wrapping around her like icy fingers. She couldn't move. Her legs felt like stone, as if they were refusing to let her go any farther. But the voice didn't stop. It seemed to grow more desperate, more forceful with each passing second. Sarah, come up here. The command, or was it a plea, hung in the air, and for a moment, Sarah wondered if she might be hearing things. Maybe it was just the wind, the house settling. She wanted to believe that, needed to believe it, but something deep within her soul knew better. The voice was calling her, pulling her, beckoning her toward the darkness at the top of the stairs. A sudden surge of cold swept through the hallway, the kind that could freeze you from the inside out, making the air feel like it had solidified. The house felt alive with something malignant, something waiting to take hold of her. Sarah's hand trembled as she gripped the railing, her fingers numb from the cold. She had no choice. She had to go up there. For Megan. Her feet moved before her mind could fully catch up, each step like dragging herself through thick tar. The stairs creaked loudly under her weight, the sound amplified in the quiet house. Her eyes darted upward, and there, just at the top of the stairs, she saw something. A shadow, a figure, barely visible but undeniable. It moved, just out of her line of sight, like it was aware of her presence, watching her every move. Sarah's breath hitched, her pulse quickening. She wanted to scream, to run, but she felt as if her legs were made of lead. The fear was paralyzing, but it wasn't enough to stop her from continuing up the stairs. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to get out, to leave, but she couldn't turn back now. Not when Megan might be up there. Her foot hit the top step and she paused, listening. The whispering stopped. The house went completely silent. The kind of silence that felt suffocating, pressing in from all sides. She couldn't hear her own breath. She couldn't hear anything but the rush of blood in her ears. Sarah slowly, cautiously, moved down the hallway, her eyes scanning every corner. The darkness seemed to cling to the walls, creeping into the corners like it was alive, suffocating everything in its path. It wasn't just the lack of light that made the hallway seem so foreboding. It was the feeling that something was there with her. Something she couldn't see, but could feel, could sense. As she passed each door, she checked them quickly, glancing inside but finding nothing but empty rooms. The house had become a labyrinth, every corner darker than the last. The air was thick, oppressive, and Sarah could feel her throat closing as she walked deeper into the house. She knew she wasn't alone. There was something here. Something that didn't want her to leave. Her mind raced, the adrenaline pumping through her veins, but it was doing little to calm the gnawing fear in the pit of her stomach. Finally, she reached the last door at the end of the hallway. Megan's room. She could feel her heart thumping in her chest, louder now, as if the room itself was vibrating with her fear. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but the door creaked when she pushed it open, the sound too loud in the silence. The room inside was dark, save for the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the curtains. It was still too still. The room looked the same as it had when she had left it, the bed unmade, the toy still sitting on the edge of the bed. But there was something new in the air. Something different. Megan was nowhere to be found. The bed was empty, but the covers were twisted and pulled back as if someone had gotten up in a hurry. Sarah stepped further into the room, her eyes scanning every inch of the space. The closet was open, but it was empty. Under the bed was empty. And then, just as she turned to leave, she heard a sound. A soft shuffle of footsteps from behind her. Her breath caught in her throat as she spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, just as it had been before. But Sarah could feel something had changed. She could feel the temperature drop, a sudden chill in the air that seeped into her bones. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, more alive, and the toy on the bed was no longer sitting upright. It had fallen, its body twisted, its eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Sarah's chest tightened, panic rising in her throat as she backed toward the door. The air felt thick, as if it were pressing down on her, suffocating her. She could feel something in the room with her, something watching, something waiting. The door slammed shut behind her, the force of it knocking her off balance. She gasped, her heart leaping into her throat as she spun around. The hallway was still, silent, but she knew something had just changed. The atmosphere had thickened, grown heavier. The darkness in the hallway seemed to move, to stretch, like a living thing. Her breathing grew shallow as she turned toward the staircase, desperate to leave this place, desperate to escape whatever was here. But as she stepped toward the stairs, she heard it again. A voice. It wasn't Megan's. It wasn't anyone she knew. "Don't go." The whisper came from somewhere deep within the house, distant but clear. The voice wasn't human, not in any way she understood. It was something darker, something ancient. Sarah froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to leave. But as she turned back toward the stairs, she knew it was already too late. Sarah's body trembled as she stood frozen on the edge of the staircase, her hand gripping the railings so tightly her knuckles turned white. The voice had come from deep within the house, distant yet chillingly clear, as if it had slipped into her very bones. It wasn't Megan's voice. It wasn't anyone she knew. It was something else, something unnatural, something that shouldn't be here. The words, soft and haunting, sent a jolt of fear through her, cutting through the suffocating silence like a blade. "Don't go," the whisper echoed in her mind, over and over, like a curse. She could still feel the weight of it, as though the very air around her had become thick with that one warning. She took a hesitant step backward, then another, unsure whether the fear coursing through her veins was enough to propel her into action. The stairs felt steeper now, the shadows clinging to the walls like they were alive, waiting to swallow her whole. The laughter had stopped, but the presence, the oppressive weight in the air, remained. It was like being trapped inside a nightmare where every move you made only deepened the horror. She needed to leave. Her mind screamed for her to run, to get out of the house, but her legs felt paralyzed. The very thought of turning her back on whatever was lurking in the darkness made her stomach turn, her senses heightened, every creak and groan of the house amplifying her growing terror. She forced herself to breathe, to think. Megan. She had to find Megan. The little girl had been there. She had been in her bed, and then, like everything else in this house, she had disappeared. Was it Megan calling out to her? Was it her voice, distorted, twisted, luring her deeper into the house? Or was it something else entirely? Something far more sinister than a lost child's cries. Sarah stepped away from the staircase, her eyes scanning the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. The house had become a maze, its walls seeming to close in on her with every passing moment. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her, but she knew that silence didn't mean safety. It only meant that whatever was here, whatever was watching her, was waiting. Watching. Waiting. The front door. She needed to reach the front door, to escape, to feel the fresh air against her skin, to breathe again without the suffocating terror that wrapped around her. She started toward the living room, her steps quickening, her pulse racing as she passed the walls lined with family photos, their faces eerily still in the dim light. But just as she neared the living room, she heard it. A faint sound at first, like the scrape of nails against wood. It came from behind her. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Her body was already on high alert, every instinct screaming at her to turn around, to face whatever was lurking in the shadows. The sound was faint, barely there, but it grew louder, more insistent. It was a scratching sound, like something, or someone, was trying to claw their way through the walls. The noise seemed to echo in the silence, reverberating through the house, until it was the only thing she could hear. Her breath caught in her throat, her legs suddenly feeling like lead. She had to know what it was. She had to understand what was happening, what was causing the house to come alive with these terrible noises. She turned slowly, almost unwillingly, her eyes darting toward the source of the sound. It was coming from the farthest room at the end of the hallway, the door to which was slightly ajar. The scratching had stopped, but the room beyond it was pitch black, the shadows darker than anything she had seen before. There was something in that room. She could feel it. Her pulse quickened, her stomach churned with an overwhelming sense of dread. The air had thickened again, heavier, as though the house was holding its breath along with her. Sarah took a tentative step toward the room, her feet dragging, reluctant to move but unable to stop herself. Each step felt like a betrayal of her own sanity. She should leave. She should turn around and run, leave everything behind, and never look back. But something pulled her forward, some deep instinct that told her she had to go in. She had to see what was waiting. She had to know. As she neared the door, she reached out a trembling hand and pushed it open, her breath caught in her chest. The room was dark, too dark. But there, in the far corner, something shifted. A figure, barely visible against the shadows, hunched low to the ground. It was still, unmoving, but Sarah could feel its presence like an electric current in the air. The room felt colder now, a biting chill that seemed to cut right through her, deep into her bones. The figure didn't move. It remained there in the corner, waiting. Sarah's body screamed at her to flee, to leave before it was too late, but her legs refused to move. Her hand, still on the door, gripped it tighter, as if that small connection to the outside world could offer some kind of protection. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she squinted into the darkness, trying to make out the shape of whatever it was. The figure shifted again, a slow, deliberate movement that sent a wave of cold fear crashing over her. "Megan?" she whispered, her voice trembling as the word left her lips, barely a breath of sound in the oppressive silence. There was no answer. The figure remained motionless, but Sarah could feel its eyes on her. She could feel the weight of its gaze even though she couldn't see its face. Something in the air shifted again, the shadows growing thicker, wrapping around her like tendrils. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing against her, suffocating her with an invisible weight. It was as though the darkness itself was alive, and it was closing in. Sarah took a hesitant step into the room, her heart in her throat. The floor creaked under her weight, the sound loud in the silence. The figure shifted again, and this time it moved toward her. Slowly, methodically, it rose from the corner. Sarah's blood ran cold as she stepped back, her legs shaking with terror. The figure was tall, too tall. It loomed in the corner of her vision, its presence overwhelming. She could feel its breath in the air, the same chill that had settled into her bones. Her mind raced. Should she scream? Should she fight back? But she couldn't move. She couldn't think. It was like her mind had short-circuited, her body paralyzed by the terror that gripped her. Then, without warning, the figure spoke. It wasn't a voice. Not exactly. It was more like a low, guttural sound, something raw and animalistic. The words were distorted, but they were clear enough to make her blood run cold. "Leave, now." The words sent a shockwave of fear through her, and Sarah stumbled backward, her heart racing, her mind screaming for her to run. But her feet wouldn't move. The room seemed to shrink around her, the air growing thicker, suffocating her. She could feel the darkness closing in, and the figure stepped forward once more. "Now," it repeated, its voice a horrible rasp. Without thinking, without a second of hesitation, Sarah turned and fled. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she raced down the hallway, back toward the stairs. She had to get out. She had to escape. The figure's voice echoed behind her, growing fainter as she ran, but she didn't stop. She didn't dare. She reached the staircase and didn't hesitate. She took the steps 2 at a time, her legs burning with the effort to escape. Her body screamed for rest, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not until she was out of this house. She reached the bottom, her heart hammering in her ears, and she ran toward the front door. The house seemed to groan beneath her feet, the walls creaking, the floorboards shifting. The door was still ajar, waiting for her. Sarah didn't hesitate. She threw it open and stepped out into the night, gasping for air, her body trembling from the sheer force of her fear. She didn't look back. She couldn't. All she knew was that whatever had been in that house, whatever had been waiting for her, hadn't finished with her yet. The house wasn't done with her. And she knew, deep in her bones, that it would follow her. The cold night air hit Sarah like a slap in the face as she stepped outside, her lungs filling with the crisp, biting air that seemed to ground her in the moment. She blinked against the sudden shift in temperature, her body shaking uncontrollably from both the fear still pulsing through her and the shock of leaving the house behind. But even as she stood there, breathing in the fresh air, the feeling of being watched never left. She could still feel the oppressive weight of the house bearing down on her, could still hear the whispers in her mind, calling her back. The moment her feet hit the gravel driveway, she felt as though the house had claimed something deep within her soul that she couldn't explain. It was like a thread had been tethered to her, pulling her toward that place, even though she had just left it behind. Sarah stood still for a moment, trying to gather her thoughts, her head spinning from the madness of the last hour. The sounds, the shadows, the whispers, they all bled together in a blur of terror that she couldn't shake. Her mind kept flashing back to the figure in the corner of the room, that inhuman presence that had risen from the shadows and locked its eyes on her. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown, the terror of being trapped in the house with something dark and powerful, but the overwhelming sense that this thing, whatever it was, wasn't finished with her. It had only begun. Her hand trembled as she reached into her pocket for her phone, desperate for some kind of connection to the outside world. The screen flickered to life, casting an eerie light across her pale face. She dialed the parent's number, her fingers shaking as she pressed the call button, but the line was silent. No ring. No connection. She tried again, her frustration mounting as the same silence greeted her. No signal. The house, it seemed, was blocking her escape, not just physically but in every way possible. It felt as though the place had become a cage, and she was still trapped in its grip even though she stood outside its walls. Her heart hammered in her chest, and her thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. What was happening? Was she losing her mind? Was it the house? Or was it something far darker? The questions pounded in her head, but no answers came. All she could feel was the gnawing sense that something was hunting her, something that had been waiting in that house, waiting for her to step into its web. Sarah glanced back at the house, the silhouette of the building rising like a dark monolith against the night sky. The windows seemed to stare back at her, empty, lifeless, but somehow full of intent. Her skin prickled with unease, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, aware of her every movement. She knew she couldn't go back inside. She couldn't let herself be drawn in again by whatever force was lurking within those walls. But she had no choice. She turned and began to walk away from the house, her steps slow, cautious, as though the very earth beneath her feet was trying to pull her back. The gravel crunched under her boots, each step louder than the last. She wanted to run, but the weight of the air around her seemed to drag her down, holding her back. Every shadow seemed to loom larger, every rustle in the trees felt like a threat, and every whisper in the wind seemed to call her name. As she reached the end of the driveway, she heard it. The faintest sound. A soft tapping, almost rhythmic, like fingernails scratching against wood. It came from behind her. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she turned, her breath coming in shallow bursts. There, just at the edge of the property, was a figure. It was difficult to make out in the darkness, but she could see the outline. Tall, impossibly tall, standing unnaturally still. She froze, the air in her lungs locking as her eyes widened in horror. The figure didn't move. It didn't blink. It just stood there, watching her, like a statue carved from the night itself. A chill ran down her spine, and her feet refused to move. She couldn't look away, couldn't tear her eyes from the thing that was watching her. It was like her body had shut down, paralyzed by the fear that gripped her. The figure was far away, but she could feel its gaze as if it were pulling her toward it, drawing her back to the house. The shadows seemed to shift around it, swirling like smoke. Her mind screamed at her to turn and run, but her body couldn't obey. Her eyes locked onto the figure, and it felt like time was stretching, like the night was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The silence hung heavy between them. The figure did not move, but she could feel it, feel the tension building in the air, like the calm before a storm. And then the sound came again. The tapping. It was louder now, as if it were getting closer. It wasn't just scratching anymore. It was knocking. Loud, forceful, like something, or someone, was trying to break its way into her world. Sarah's chest tightened, her throat closing as the noise filled the air, coming from all directions now, from the trees, the ground, the very space around her. Her body finally reacted, and she stumbled backward, her legs shaking. She took a step, then another, her feet dragging in the gravel, as if it were trying to hold her in place. She didn't look away from the figure. She couldn't. Her mind was locked onto it, as though it were the only thing that mattered. The tapping grew louder, faster, like a countdown to something horrible, something she couldn't understand. And then the figure moved. It was slow, deliberate, like it was savoring her fear. It took one step forward, and Sarah felt it, felt the weight of its presence bearing down on her. A scream rose in her throat, but no sound came out. She was frozen, her feet planted in place, the night air thick with dread. The figure took another step. And then another. It was coming for her. Sarah forced herself to move, to run. Her body finally obeyed, and she bolted down the driveway, her feet pounding against the gravel, her heart racing in her chest. She didn't dare look back. She didn't want to know if it was still following her, didn't want to see the figure moving toward her with its eerie, deliberate steps. All she knew was that she had to get away. She had to keep moving. She couldn't stop, couldn't let herself think for a second that she was safe. She reached the road, her breath ragged, her body trembling with fear. Her eyes flicked to the sky, the moon hanging overhead, casting a pale light over the world. There was nothing in sight, no one around. The house was behind her now, a distant silhouette in the dark. She should be safe. She should feel safe. But the air was still thick with the feeling of being watched. The weight of the house still pressed down on her, a constant presence she couldn't escape. And then, just as she thought she might be able to breathe again, she heard it. A soft, familiar whisper in the wind, so quiet she almost didn't hear it. "You can't escape." The voice wasn't just in the wind. It was inside her head. The same voice that had whispered to her in the house. The same voice that had haunted her every step. It wasn't coming from anywhere. It was inside her. It was everywhere. "Please," Sarah whispered to the night, her voice barely audible. "Please, leave me alone." But there was no answer. Only the wind, carrying with it the soft echo of the words, fading into the night. Sarah's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as she staggered down the empty road, her legs aching with the effort of carrying her body forward despite the weight of fear pulling her back. The night was still, far too still, and the further she moved away from the house, the more her surroundings seemed to close in on her. The darkness wasn't just a void, it was something tangible, something that wrapped around her like an invisible hand, gripping tighter with every step she took. The whispering, the tapping, the distant cries, they still clung to her, echoes in her mind that refused to be shaken off. She wanted to scream, to let the terror out, but her voice was caught somewhere deep in her throat, trapped by the weight of the nightmare she had just experienced. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, as though the road itself was resisting her escape, pulling her back toward the house that had become a prison, a nightmare that was now ingrained in her very soul. She glanced over her shoulder, the hairs on the back of her neck rising as she scanned the empty road behind her. Nothing. No figures. No shapes lurking in the darkness. But even as she told herself she was safe, that she had made it out, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her, waiting for the moment when she would falter, when she would stop running. The whispering didn't stop. It had changed now, becoming less of a whisper and more of a growl, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through her chest, as if it were coming from the very earth beneath her feet. "You can't leave. You're ours." The words were clear now, no longer hidden in the shadows of the night. The voice was everywhere, inside her mind, in the wind, in the rustle of the leaves overhead. It was no longer just an eerie sound. It was a presence, a force that surrounded her, sinking into her bones. Sarah stumbled, her heart thudding painfully against her ribcage as she struggled to keep her pace. She couldn't hear anything but the voice now, the voice that had chased her out of the house and followed her into the night. The road stretched out before her, long and empty, but the silence seemed deafening, broken only by the disjointed whispers that wrapped around her, trying to pull her back to where it all started. She reached the end of the road, the small town in the distance just beginning to come into view. Relief washed over her, but it was a fleeting thing, a small, fragile moment that didn't last. She had escaped the house, but she had not escaped whatever had been waiting for her there. She could still feel it, still sense it, lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. Her mind raced with questions. Was it human? Was it a spirit? Was it something worse? She had never believed in the supernatural, never entertained the thought of ghosts or spirits, but what she had experienced tonight had shattered everything she had ever known about the world. What had happened in that house wasn't just fear. It was something real, something far darker than she had ever imagined. The town was closer now, the lights from street lamps flickering in the distance. Sarah's footsteps quickened as she moved toward it, the promise of civilization, of safety, pulling her forward. But even as she walked, she could feel the presence, still lurking in the shadows, just out of reach, waiting for the moment when she would let her guard down. She glanced around, half expecting to see a figure emerge from the darkness, but the road remained empty. She didn't know how much further she could go. Her legs were shaking, her whole body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She hadn't felt this helpless in years. The terror that had gripped her in the house had seeped into her very being, leaving her feeling hollow, drained. She was no longer sure of what was real and what wasn't. She had left the house, but had she truly escaped? Or was it all still waiting for her, following her from behind, just out of sight? As she reached the outskirts of the town, she spotted a few cars parked on the side of the road, their headlights casting long shadows against the pavement. Her heart skipped a beat. There were people nearby. Real people. She wasn't alone anymore. But just as she was about to step toward the nearest vehicle, something stopped her. A voice, not a whisper this time, but a clear, unmistakable sound that froze her in place. "You shouldn't have left." The voice was familiar, chillingly so. It was the same voice that had followed her through the house, that had haunted her every step. But now it was here, outside, in the open, just as real as the ground beneath her feet. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she slowly turned around. Her eyes searched the dark expanse of the road, but she couldn't see anything. No figure, no shadow. Just darkness. But she could feel it. The presence. It was there, watching her from the distance, waiting. And then the tapping came again, faint at first, but growing louder. Like nails against wood, each one more urgent than the last. It was coming from behind her, from the house, from the very direction she had just escaped. Her mind screamed at her to keep moving, to keep running, but her body refused to obey. She couldn't make her legs move fast enough. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her heartbeat thudding in her ears as she stared into the darkness, feeling the weight of something pressing against her, suffocating her. The road, the town, everything seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of the tapping, the low, rhythmic noise that seemed to be coming closer, closer. She tried to turn around and run, but her body refused to listen. Her feet were frozen in place, her body locked in fear, her mind screaming at her to escape. The presence was growing stronger, more tangible, and it was coming for her. She could feel it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched, of being hunted. The tapping grew louder, faster, until it was all she could hear, drowning out everything else. Each sound a reminder of what had happened in the house, of what had been waiting for her there. And then the figure appeared. It was just a shape at first, a vague silhouette emerging from the darkness, but it was unmistakable. It was the same thing she had seen in the house, standing at the top of the stairs, waiting in the shadows. It was tall, too tall, and its movements were slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as it stepped closer, its shadow stretching across the ground, stretching toward her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was stand there, rooted to the spot, watching as the figure drew closer, its outline becoming clearer, more distinct. The air around her seemed to vibrate, to hum with some kind of dark energy, and she felt it, the cold, icy chill that came from its presence. She wanted to scream, to run, but she was frozen. The tapping stopped, and the world fell into a deathly silence. And then it spoke. "You can never leave." The voice was a whisper, but it filled her ears, her mind, the very air around her. The words echoed in the stillness, and Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach. She wanted to scream, to fight, to break free from whatever this thing was, but she was too afraid, too paralyzed. All she could do was stare at it, the figure that was now standing just a few feet in front of her, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It took another step forward. The figure moved closer, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was toying with her fear. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, her entire body trembling in the cold night air. Every step it took sent a wave of dread washing over her, each footfall a reminder of the terror that had followed her from the house. The thing before her wasn't human. No, not in any way she could comprehend. It was something else entirely, something ancient and dark, something that shouldn't exist. And yet, here it was, towering over her, its hollow eyes fixed on her with a gaze so cold it felt like it was cutting into her soul. She couldn't tear her eyes away from it. The closer it came, the more the world around her seemed to shrink. The road, the lights of the town in the distance, the air itself, it all blurred into the background as the figure loomed larger and larger in her vision, consuming everything in its path. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. Her body was frozen in place, caught in the grip of something far stronger than fear. It stopped just in front of her, and for a moment, there was nothing but the eerie silence between them. Sarah could hear the thudding of her own heartbeat, pounding in her ears like a drum, deafening and relentless. Her breath came in shallow, desperate gasps, each one colder than the last. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, thick with an oppressive presence that made her chest feel tight, as though she couldn't get enough air. And then it spoke. The voice wasn't a sound. It wasn't something that came from its mouth or through its throat. No, it was inside her mind. It was a thought, an idea, implanted deep into her skull, pressing against her brain until she couldn't think of anything else. You can't run. You can't escape. You belong to us now. The words echoed inside her head, louder than the beating of her heart, clearer than the sound of her breath. It wasn't just a message, it was a command, an inevitable truth. A truth she couldn't escape. The darkness that had followed her, the presence that had haunted her every step, it wasn't something she could outrun. It was inside her now. It had always been inside her. Sarah tried to step back, her legs finally responding, her body desperate to get away from whatever this thing was. But as she moved, it moved with her, its form following her every motion, always a step ahead. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, the gravel crunching with each step like it was trying to hold her down, to keep her in place, to trap her. She reached for her phone again, but when she pulled it out, the screen was blank. No signal, no connection, just an empty void of nothingness. It was useless. You thought you could leave, the figure continued, its voice a dark, guttural rasp that sent a cold chill running up her spine. You thought you could outrun what's been waiting. But you can't. You never could. The words sliced through her, deep into her bones, and she gasped, her body trembling harder than ever before. It wasn't just its presence that was terrifying, it was the way it spoke, the way it seemed to know her so intimately. It wasn't just watching her, it understood her, saw into her very soul. And it was telling her that there was no way out. No escape. She turned and ran. There was nothing else to do. Her mind screamed at her to move, to get away, to fight, to survive. Her feet pounded against the gravel, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. She pushed forward, her arms flailing as she tried to break free from the weight of the presence that still loomed behind her. But no matter how fast she ran, the figure was always there, in her periphery, in her thoughts, in her bones. With every step, she felt the air grow colder, the night darker. The town seemed farther away now, the lights a distant illusion, a false sense of safety. The whispering started again, not from the figure this time, but from the very ground beneath her, from the very walls of the town itself. You can't hide. We'll find you. We'll always find you. She was panicking now, her body moving on instinct, not even thinking anymore. Her mind was overloaded with terror, with a single, overwhelming thought: survival. She had to survive. But the more she ran, the more she felt like she was getting nowhere. The shadows around her stretched, grew, like dark fingers reaching out from the corners of the world, closing in on her. She looked over her shoulder again. There was nothing there, nothing visible at least. But she could feel it. It was still behind her, following her every step, watching her every move. The road felt endless, stretching on and on, the town's lights still far away. The whispers in her mind were growing louder, more urgent, more desperate. You can't outrun the darkness. It's in you now. She felt her feet give way beneath her, and before she could stop herself, she was stumbling to the ground, her knees scraping against the rough gravel. She hit the ground hard, pain flaring through her body, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. She had to get up, had to keep going. Sarah scrambled to her feet, wiping the dirt from her hands, her eyes darting around wildly as she tried to regain some sense of control. But the more she looked around, the more the world around her seemed to close in. The trees, the buildings, the streetlights, they were all fading, all warping as though the world itself was shifting, reshaping. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, shifting, as if the earth was alive and moving. The whispers became louder. It's in you. It's already in you. She clutched her head, her hands trembling, pressing against her temples as the voices grew, became more frantic. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. The fear was too overwhelming. It was drowning her. The world around her twisted and contorted, the sky overhead darkening, the lights from the town fading into nothingness. She was alone now, alone in a world that no longer made sense, trapped in a nightmare that she couldn't escape. And then, the figure was there, standing just in front of her, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. It was so close now she could feel its presence, its coldness seeping into her skin, filling her body with ice. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her voice was gone. Her breath was gone. Her entire body was gone, trapped in the cold grip of whatever this thing was. You can't run anymore, it whispered, its voice like the scratching of nails against stone. You never could. Sarah felt her knees buckle, her body sinking to the ground as the darkness pressed in on her from every side. She was drowning in it, suffocating beneath the weight of the presence that had followed her from the house. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. All she could do was wait for the thing that had been waiting for her, that had always been waiting for her, to claim her. And then the world went black.